Welcome. Hopefully the technical equipment now works, so we can switch slides without it taking 40 seconds like the last talk. I feel really bad for them, so welcome. My name is Turid. I'm going to talk to you about side channel analysis. How many here has heard about side channel analysis before? Okay, can Turtlesec take their hands down? How many have heard about side channel analysis? Okay, a few. So, just a warning, it's a very technical talk. If you don't want to look at specific byte values in the middle of the AES encryption algorithm, feel free to leave. But please stay if you want to look at that. So I will just, actually I'll go over the outline later. A little bit about me, because I don't think many of you know me. I have some education apparently, so I have a bachelor's in mathematics and engineering. And I put that up there to say that, look, I know some math, because you need some math to know some crypto. And a master in information security from Gjøvik. I'm sure more people in the room has that. And then I worked for about 15 years as a cryptographer. Don't ask me about cryptocurrencies, they're evil. But everything else in crypto is good. So usually my job title has been something like security analyst. I've worked for these organizations, so the Norwegian National Security Authority, where I looked at approving cryptographic equipment that was going to be used for the lowest security level in Norway. And then I worked for Conax. Apparently they're called Nagra now, but we refused to accept that even when I was there. So doing encryption of TV signals, which in fancy language is called content protection of DVB. And then I went back to the military world and worked for Thales Norway, making cryptographic equipment for the military. And when I say cryptographic equipment for the military, I mean actual physical boxes that encrypt stuff, because that's how the military works. And recently I worked for Turtlesec for a few months. Apparently I'm still an accepted member of Turtlesec, even though I don't work there. As a consultant doing some PKI stuff. If you, for some reason, want to talk about X509 certificates, I'll probably remember the details for 5 more days. I'm so-called in between jobs, literally. But my next job will be at Riskier, which is a company, it's a security lab. And so if you make anything in IT, hardware or software, that you think should do some security, you can send it to Riskier and they will analyze it for you. They're also very, very good at side channel analysis, which is why I really want to work there. Okay, so my talk. First, I need to just introduce side channel analysis. Basically start with what is a side channel and how can we use it to analyze stuff. And then I'm going to talk about the AES encryption algorithm, because the main part of my talk is going to be how we can use side channel analysis to break AES. And we need to know how AES works to do that. And then I'm going to talk about correlation power analysis, which is the specific type of side channel analysis I'm going to show you how to use to break AES. And then side channel considerations. I just have some generalizations at the end and some conclusions. Okay, so the first section, introduction to side channel analysis. So what is a side channel? It's any physical channel that can leak information about your security measure. So you're using a security measure to try to protect a secret, and any physical channel that can leak information about this is called a side channel. And this is a fun example. Using a stethoscope to crack a safe is a side channel attack. Using the side channel sound. So examples of side channels are power consumption. So when your chip runs some kind of code, you can measure the power consumption and learn something about the secrets. That's what we're going to do later with AES. Electromagnetic radiation basically works the same way as the power consumption. It leaks information about what's running. And then there's sound. I've also seen sound used to break AES on a CPU. It's very strange. I saw it, RSA on the CPU. I saw it on one conference many years ago. I don't remember what they did, but they used sound coming from the processor. I've read that heat can be in a side channel. I don't have an example of how to use it. And timing of operations. I have an example later, actually on this slide. So a side channel attack then is an attack that analyzes and exploits the information that you learn from the side channel. And then you use that to derive some secret information. So examples, the first one we saw already, cracking a safe combination with a stethoscope. So this is an example of a timing side channel. If you measure the time of this, the running time of this algorithm, which I am my assistant, also my spouse, incidentally, has informed me this is valid Python code, and this is correct. I'm not the best at Python. While n is bigger than 0, subtract n from 1. So you understand that if you measure the running time of this, you will learn something about the value of n. And if the value of n is secret, then that's oops. Especially if you can run it several times and the value changes, right? And then the final example is basically what we're going to do later, using power consumption data to learn about the internal state of a crypto operation that's going on. And then hopefully we can derive the secret key from this knowledge. Okay, so how do we do this in practice? Power analysis, which is using the power measurements then. This picture is of, this is the lab setup that I use. And I have it up here as well. So just basically, I just fell off the stage. Because I wanted to point, so this red card is really just there to measure power on whatever's running on the blue card. So the crypto operation is running on this. It's a 32-bit processor. And this measures the power consumption and sends it via this cable to this one, which is basically an oscilloscope, because oscilloscopes today are just like analog to digital converters. So it sends all the measurement data to the laptop via the USB cable. And then if you want to see the fancy graphs, you can just plot them on the laptop. So more technically, there's a resistor connected in series with a power supply. And you can use that to observe the power consumption. And yeah, the oscilloscope digitizes the power measurements, and then we use the computer to analyze it. Okay, so we're going to explain it later, or show it to you later. So AES, the AES crypto algorithm. I say it's probably the most widely used data encryption algorithm. I kind of hope it is. It's the algorithm used if you want to encrypt more than just a small chunk of data. So usually if you're using something asymmetric, like RSA or elliptic curve, you use that only to derive a key that you can then use with AES to encrypt your real data. AES is easy to implement both in hardware and software, relatively easy. And it also performs well on a wide variety of hardware. When they had the competition to find the AES standard, these were all things they wanted from the algorithm. So they wanted it to work well on both hardware and software. And the standard comes with 3 key lengths, 128, 192, or 256 bits. I've never heard about anyone using 192 bits. 128 is basically enough. However, 256 doesn't run that much slower, so a lot of people just use that. Also, if you're worried about quantum computing, 256 is good. I'm going to analyze the smallest one, the 128 bits, because it's easier in the example. So, a bit more about AES then. It's a block cipher. It takes in a plain text, encrypts it using a secret key, and outputs the ciphertext. And just so the figures I've made for this presentation, the rectangles with square, pointy corners, that's data. And then these rounded corner ones are my functions. And because I've worked too long in the military context, secret data is red or pink, and encrypted data is black. So anytime there's something pink, it's a plain text or a key. Okay, so I said it's a block cipher. That means that it can only encrypt a set number of bytes at a time. So the block size of AES is 128 bits, which means that the only thing it can do is take a plain text that's exactly 128 bits and produce the ciphertext that's exactly 128 bits. Key size can vary, but the block size is the same. So if you want to encrypt more than this, you just have to run it again on the next block. And then there are good ways of doing that makes it more secure. But we are just going to assume today that you just do this again for the next block. Yes. It makes the attack easier to explain. But you can do attacks on other modes as well. Yeah. So the other thing about AES is that it's a symmetric cipher, as opposed to the like RSA and elliptic curve, which are asymmetric. So first of all, decryption is the inverse of encryption. They look very similar. And again, the main thing with a symmetric algorithm is that you use the same secret key for both encryption and decryption. So this is AES. I drew it for you. So right now you don't see the key input anymore, but it's being added in these, like, you see these functions have pink frames, so something secret is being added there. But just the overview of this algorithm, you start with the plain text and you send it into the first, so there are 4 like sub-functions, into the first one, which is called add round key, and then the output of that goes into the subbytes. Output of that goes into shift rows, and the output of that goes into mixed columns. And then you repeat like 9, 11, or 13 times, depending on your key length. And in the last round, apparently this doesn't do anything good for you in the last round, so you skip it and do an extra add round key. And the output from that is just your ciphertext. So I said I didn't show you the key input, right? It's just magically in those add round key functions. The thing is, we do the add round key 10, 12, or 14 times, depending on your key length. And each time we require 128 bits of key material, but we don't have that. We have 128, 192, or 256. So there's a key expansion function that you run first. I'm not going to say what it does, it's deterministic. And it makes the number of 128 bits round keys that you need, and it preserves. So if your input key has all the good randomness properties, all the round keys will look random, like they won't be a bunch of ones in a row or something. But you don't gain any more entropy. It's just that it takes this and expands it in a good way to like 10, 12, or 14 of those round key blocks. This is also, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, reversible. So yeah, if you have, I'll cover it later, but if you have one round key, you can go back up if your input key is 128 bits. If your input key is 256, you need to know 2 of the round keys, 2 consecutive ones. Okay, so one more thing about AES. It has a state. It keeps a state matrix, so the block size is 128 bits, which is 16 bytes. And it just keeps them in a matrix like this. So for some reason, it fills the columns first. And so when you start the algorithm, you just take your 128-bit plain text and load into this matrix of bytes. And that's the starting state. And then those 4 functions will just operate on this state. So let's go back to this. So now we know that what happens here, right, with the plain text, is that you just put it into your state matrix. And then you input the state matrix to the add round key function. So we're going to look at the 4 functions. For the attack, we need to know what the first 2 functions do. We actually don't need these 2, but I'm going to explain them briefly, so just so you can see that they're not like super difficult or anything. But first, the add round key function. You take your state and you XOR in your round key, which you have also loaded into a matrix like this. And it's basically just byte by byte XOR. So yeah, look, my key is pink, and now this is both yellow and pink. Yay. But yeah, so what happens in the add round key function is that you add some more randomness, like you add in key material. This is the only function that actually adds key material. The other three functions, if you know the input, you know the output. Like if you know the state before the function, you know it after the function. So the next function is subbytes, where you take each byte in the state and just substitute it with another byte that you find in the lookup table. And this lookup table is called the S-box. And it's in the AES specification. So if you know the byte, you look it up and you substitute it with what's in the lookup table. And that's it. So the shift row function, I think they should call it rotate row. It takes the rows of the state matrix and shifts them to the left, but then wraps around. So I think it's a rotate. The first row just stays the same. The second row gets shifted 1 to the left with a wraparound. The third row gets shifted 2 to the left, and the final row 3 to the left. So we don't change the values of any bytes, we just move them around. And then the final function, mix columns. So I've just changed the variable names from B to D, but I'll show you what happens. You take each column, so you start with the left column of B0 to B3, and you do a matrix multiplication, which again, this matrix is just in the specification. So you multiply the matrix by the column in the state matrix, and you get a new column, and you put it in the same place. And you do the same with the next columns. So you input B4 to B7, and then you get D4 to D7 with the same matrix. And surprise, it's not the matrix multiplication you think it is. It happens in a finite field, which is just a weird math thing from abstract algebra. It's not hard to implement. So even if you don't know, actually don't go home and implement AES, it's not a good idea. But even if you don't know this math, you can just look up how to implement this matrix, and it's really easy. Okay, so now we know AES, right? We input the plain text, and then we do these 4 functions a bunch of time, and then we do an extra add round key, and we get our ciphertext. Any questions? So everybody knows AES? Oh yeah, just one more thing. Actually, I didn't even put in the key sizes here, but this is literally the only difference between the different versions of AES is the input key size and how many rounds you do. Everything else is the same. I can also say that AES decryption looks extremely similar. You start here, then you do an add round key, then you do an inverse shift rows and inverse subbytes. And add round key is its own inverse, and you just have an inverse mixed columns here. So it's exactly what you think it would be. Okay, so correlation power analysis. It's one specific type of side channel analysis. So it's a power analysis, so we look at the power consumption of the chip that's running the code. And correlation power analysis means that we're using a statistical function to compute correlation between the data in the AES function and the power measurements. And I'm immediately going to shorten correlation power analysis to CPA. And the premise for CPA to work is that there is a correlation, it's usually small, but it's there, between the power consumption on the chip that's running an operation and the data that this operation manipulates. So there, in our example then, there is a correlation between the values of the state matrix at some point and the power measurements. So how do we do this attack then? we make our crypto implementation, our AES implementation, perform encryption of a number of different plaintext blocks. For example, 50. I know 50 is going to work with this, so, but this depends a lot on how much noise you have. So usually if your environment is noisy, you just need to encrypt more blocks and measure the power measurements of all of them. And then, yeah, so we encrypt 50 different blocks of plaintext, and for now we need to know the plaintext. I know this doesn't sound very realistic, but for now just suspend your disbelief. We know the plaintext. This is, we're looking for the key, which is much more powerful than having the plaintext. So all encryptions are done using the same key, and we record the power measurements for each encryption. So we need to store like, this power measurement was for this plaintext block, and this was for this plaintext block, all 50 of them. So usually, we don't really need this graph or anything, but usually when you measure the power consumption during an AES 128, if you plot it, it looks something like this. And the fun thing is that you can see that there are 10 rounds in AES 128. Again, we can't read the key out from the graph or anything. It's just that if you're in a more realistic scenario and if you have like just a box doing encryption and you don't really know when to start your power measurement, you just measure for a long time and then you look at the graph and you can usually recognize where the crypto is going on. And then you can analyze on just that part. But this is like a continuous graph. What does the data look like? It looks something like this. So if we have 50 plaintexts, we have like 50 of these vectors with just a bunch of numbers. I think these are voltages. It doesn't really matter too much as long as they correlate to the data. So it's probably like maybe a couple of thousand entries in each row. And those are just like discrete measurements of power along the time axis. Okay, so back to AES. Now, in my example, we are doing a side channel analysis of AES 128. So now we're doing like 10 rounds. However, it doesn't really matter because we're going to attack in the first round only right here. So we're going to look at the state matrix after we've done add round key and subbytes in the first round. And what does the state matrix look like at that exact time? It looks like this. So you've done plaintext XOR the first round key, and then you do the SBox lookup. And that's what it looks like. So we will try to correlate this data with the power measurement. And this attack is basically like divide and conquer or something. So we're going to focus on only one byte. I only care about the first byte, the one with frame around it. So I'm going to try to figure out what that byte of the round key is. So basically, we're going to guess what key 0 is. And we know P0, right? Because that's the plaintext. And I said we know the plaintext. And really what we're going to do is that we're going to just exhaustive search this key byte. We're going to guess all the possible values, which is like 256 different values from 0 to 255, and compute S of key 0 XOR P0 for each of the possible values of the key byte, and correlate that with the power trace, and see which one gives us the highest correlation. And that one is usually the correct byte for the key. And a slight correction, because the correlation is usually between the power consumption and the numbers of bits that are set in this value. So we're going to take the Hamming weight. We're not going to use S of key 0 XOR P0. We're going to use the Hamming weight of that. And if you don't know what the Hamming weight is, it's exactly what I said on the slide. It's the number of 1 bits in your value. And I'm not an expert in the physics of this, but yeah, I believe that there is a difference in how much power you use depending on how many bits are set in your data. Also, the attack works, so I'm just going to trust the people who said this. Okay, so I said we're going to compute correlation. I'm also not, I'm just going to stand here and tell you what I'm not good at. I'm also not good at statistics. But someone who is, like Pearson apparently, came up with this formula for a correlation coefficient, and that's what we're going to use. It computes the correlation between two random variables, x and y. So it goes through all the x's and subtracts the mean of all the x values, and do the same with the y's. So in here we're going to say that x is the Hamming weights of S of K0, X, or P0 for all the 50 different plain texts. So N is 50 here. And then Y is then the power measurement for each of those plain texts at a given time. And we have to do it for all the times, but I'm going to kind of just hand wave that away and say that we find the best correlation for this key bit. So just to repeat, because I assume you didn't all get that immediately from my words. Again, so we're going to say, okay, I guess now that the first byte of the key is 0. And then I compute S of P0, X, or K0. And K0 is now 0. But for all of the 50 plain text blocks. And then I take the Hamming weights of those. And I compute the correlation between those Hamming weights and our power consumption. And then I guess that K0 is now 1. And I do the same and I compute the correlations. So we do that for all possible values of K0, getting like 256 different correlations, and we just pick the biggest one. It's actually the absolute value because correlation can be negative and it's still a match. But we pick the max correlation and we say that the key byte value that gave us that correlation, that's our K0. And this is just an example of like one experiment that was run on this. These are 256 correlations, and you can see which one. Yeah, it's up there. This is the K0 I'm choosing to believe is actually K0. Yeah. I don't, this is just, I don't even remember where this data is at, like when I did it. But yeah, there's usually a big difference. At least with this, like, this is just an ideal setup, right? So if you have something that produces a lot, like does a lot more things, or there are other powers close by that maybe you're picking up, it's not this distinct, but just to show you that if you're just running it on a chip and nothing else and measure very closely, it's a good attack. So we have found K0, or our best guess, but you know, according to the previous slide, it's a pretty good guess. So then we go back to the state matrix and we move on to the next entry in the state matrix and guess key values for key 1 and do the same thing. And for the rest of the key bytes. So we just repeat the attack for each entry in the state matrix to find the 16 different bytes of the round key. And from the round key, as I said, because the key expansion thing is invertible, we can deduce the input key. Also, if we do what I did now and analyze the first round, the round key is the input key. Because that's just how the key expansion works. The first copy is the key into the first round key, and then it does some things. But that doesn't really matter. It's not hard to invert the key expansion function. So yeah, now we have found the key in 16 times 2 to the 8 guesses, which is 2 to the 12, because I'm good at math. And that's a lot better than trying to guess the whole key without any information, because that's 2 to the 128, and you cannot do that. But 2 to the 12 is easy, it goes fast. Okay, So this is where everything could go wrong, right? I'm going to show you this. So I can tell you a little bit about my hardware as well. I'm just going to find my browser. Okay, so I'm running. So this hardware, it's called Chip Whisperer. It's made by a company called New AE. And I bought all of this for like a few thousand kroner, I think. And they also have a software, like some Python code, that you just get off their GitHub. And they have pretty good documentation for how to use it. So seriously, if you don't know anything about side channel attacks, but you think it sounds fun, you can basically buy this stuff, use their software, and you can run an attack without knowing what you're doing. Just press play on their demo, basically. But they also have nice tutorials laid out, like they tell you about AES, and then they're like, okay, insert your code here. So I'm using most of their code. My wonderful assistant, again, removed all the unnecessary things. But just to show you, so this is run in, so it's Python code and it's run in an environment called Jupyter, which is just you run a block of code and then you see the outputs immediately. So it works very well for this. We're just setting some environment things. So scope type, OpenADC, that's this oscilloscope. You can also this isn't the best oscilloscope in the world. So I've also done this by connecting a better oscilloscope just from a different vendor, and then you just have to specify something else. Platform, that's the chip we're running the AES code on. So it's a 32-bit processor that sits on here. And crypto target is the AES implementation. Tiny AES 128 is something that ships with Chip Whisperer. I've also done the attack on the same hardware with embed TLS and their AES implementation. And that works as well. And the generic setup script is basically their code to connect. So hopefully it will say it found Chip Whisperer. Yes. Okay. So now we need to compile the code for the AES target. And this is just a bash command and a make file. And we're looking for this. It built. Oops. And then this takes a bit of time actually loading the code onto the target. Yes, good. So now comes the fun part. We're going to send in the key and the plaintexts and record the power measurements. And I set my key. Dead beef cafe bebe 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. So it's easily recognizable, right? And n equals 50 is that we're going to do encrypt 50 plaintext blocks. And this is just this line generates a random plaintext block. So just random data. It doesn't really matter. It can be like real plaintext, but we just need them to be different from each other, the blocks. So this is a way to do that. And then we're sending them in and capturing traces for this scope and this target, and the plaintext block and the key. And recording the traces. And it's done. So I'm not even showing you the code, right? But I think it's the attack code. I don't even know which, yeah. So here we're going to look at the S-box output. That's the model we're using, because there are other ways of doing side channel attacks, but we're specifying that. And we're running the attack, and then the last line is basically how to show us the results. And this is the way that the Chip Whisperer, if you just use their attack code here, it will show us a table with 16 columns, 1 column for each key byte. And then I think there are like 6 rows under that. We will see. And the top row is like the best guess at the moment for each key byte, with the correlation listed underneath. And then the second row is like the next best guess at the moment with its correlation and stuff like that. And it does this because it computes the correlation gradually, adding more and more traces to its computation. So we will see the correct bytes like moving up the table, and the correct bytes are encoded in red, just so it's easier for us to see. And there's going to be an error message, but it will go away, is hopefully the thing. Yes? So you can see the red ones moving up. And yes, it found the key after like 35 traces. So we can actually go back. Yeah, I think I have time for that. And just set the n to, so I can set it to 35 and show you that it will still be able to do it, or I can set it to something lower and we can see, let's do like 25. Because then we're not, I don't think we will find all the bytes, but we will find some of them. And I can set this to update a bit slower, like, that's just how many traces it takes before it updates the table. Yeah, it's done. So you see that the ones it couldn't find, they're not too far off, right? But, oh, some of them are, like byte number 7 and 8, it's not even close. So yeah, it takes you, so this shows that you need to have a certain number of different plaintexts for this statistics thing to work. And that's usually, as I said, if you have a lot of noise in your measurements, you need more plaintext blocks. Okay, this is hardware, so we need to disconnect so it won't yell at me later. However, usually just unplugging it also works. Don't try that at home. Okay. So, some more thoughts on this. Yes, the first thing, known plaintext. First of all, it's not unrealistic in all scenarios. Like you have, if you encrypt like Word files, you know what the header is going to be. And if you encrypt a lot of Word files, you can just look at the blocks that you know is a known header and just not look at the other ones. And I said, so someone here said electronic codebook mode is the mode we're using AES in right now. That's what you do when you just take like one plaintext block, encrypt it, next plaintext block, encrypt it in the same way. Don't use AES like that. It's not a good idea. Instead, you should do something that makes, so if you have the same plaintext block twice, it shouldn't give you the same ciphertext block twice. You should add something else to it. And I would say two of the most commonly used AES modes are known as counter mode and GCM mode. And they both use this thing where they don't put your plaintext through AES. They put an IV or a counter through AES, and the output from AES is used as a key that you XOR with your actual plaintext. And this is fine as long as you never reuse that IV with the same key. However, because AES is a good algorithm, you can do this and you can have this counter or IV that you put into AES. It can be known because even if you know the plaintext, AES doesn't tell you anything about the ciphertext. So even if you know the input AES, you don't know the secret key and you don't know the output. So you can encrypt things like this. However, it gives us an opportunity to know the plaintext that goes into AES for side channel analysis. Just if you're going home to look this up later, AES or side channel analysis of counter mode is a bit more complicated than that because the plaintext blocks are so similar that you don't get very much statistical variety. But there is a way to do it. You just have to analyze like 4 or 5 rounds, and then you get the key. But my point still holds that you know the plaintext, right? In a lot of AES encryption that happens, we know the plaintext input of AES. We just don't know the plaintext that's finally getting encrypted. However, we don't need to know the plaintext. We can also know the ciphertext. So instead of going from the front of the algorithm, we can go from the back. So we know the ciphertext. We guess on the last round key, and then we compute our way into the middle of that round and analyze the state matrix there. I'm not going to show it on a figure, but it works the same way. One reason I'm not going to show it is that the mixed columns function is weird. But yeah, so you do the attack on the final round, finding that round key, but then you need to do the actual inverse of the key expansion, because you don't have the first round key anymore, you have the last one. But as I said, you can just do that. Look the specification up and do it. Yeah, so as I said, the key expansion is reversible. And for AES 128, you need to know just one of these. So it can even be like round key number 6, if that's where you're attacking. And for AES 256, I'll come back to 256, you need to know 2 consecutive ones. And since no one is using AES 192, I don't actually know. I assume you need to know 1, 1.5, or 2. So what about AES 256? As I said, to get the input key, you need to know 2 consecutive round keys. So how do you do that? So if we're attacking from the beginning of the algorithm again with a known plaintext, you do exactly what we did in the example. So you get the first round key. But then you can compute the output from the first round, the state matrix after the first round. And that's the state matrix that's the input to the second round, which is basically like knowing the plaintext for the first round. So now you know the input to the second round and you do the exact same attack. You know the input and you XOR it with the key that you're guessing. You take the S-box, take the Hamming weight, and do the correlation there. And you can also do it from the back, knowing the ciphertext, going backwards the same way I explained. You just have to do the final 2 rounds, just not the final round. And we haven't talked about decryption. I briefly said that there is an inverse of all of those 4 functions. And you can also do the attack there, because it's so similar. And it works with both known plaintext and known ciphertext. So, usually, right, encryption is used to, so when you teach crypto to people, you're like, so, it's always Alice and Bob, by the way. So there's this person named Alice, and she wants to send a message to Bob, and it needs to be very secret so that the evil eavesdropper Eve, who's in the middle listening to the channel, cannot read it. So the whole thing is that Alice is over here with her computer, writing her plaintext, and then encrypting it, and then sending it over some kind of channel. And Eve is on the channel, but she's not on the computer, right? So what we've done here is that we've moved the attack to the computer where the encryption or the decryption happens. This message is still perfectly secure on the network. If you haven't first attacked the computer, of course. So in general, side channel attacks they only work if you have access to the chip running the code, and you don't always have that. But sometimes you do, and if you have a product that's running AES, and you just give the product to your enemy, like, I don't see anyone from Konax Nagra here. So say your business is that you're in the content, in the DVB business, and you have a set-top box that decrypts the TV signals, right? And you give the set-top box to the customer, and the customer wants free TV. So this box runs a lot of decryptions. so you can just attack it. So there are several, as opposed to like if you're in the military and you have this like crypto box, you're a soldier and you carry it with you, like you protect it with your life. It's less likely that someone is going to be able to run a lot of decryptions on your equipment, because as soon as you lose it, you report it to all the accounting things. And then they disable it, or they don't use that key anymore, or whatever, right? So there are different scenarios. If you're on your computer and don't give that computer to someone else, then I don't know, you could be secure. However, so there was this attack maybe a couple of years ago called Platypus. That paper had a lot of attacks in it, but one of them was a CPA attack. Because Intel had this brilliant idea that we have these processors and we should measure how much power they consume so that we can like keep track of that, and if they use a lot of power, we should do something. And if they don't use enough power, then maybe there's something wrong and we should do something. And that's fine. The problem is that they stored this power measurement in a register that was available to user space. If you were on Linux, it was even available to unprivileged users. I think on Windows you needed to have a privileged user, but still. So the resolution of these power measurements wasn't quite enough to do CPA. But the researchers figured out if they just encrypted a lot of data, they could do some averages and get measurements that made them find the key. I'm pretty sure Intel has fixed this because it was a couple of years ago, and they did the whole, they did alert Intel first and all the things you're supposed to do. It's just an example of you need physical access unless someone just records it for you and puts it in a register. You can even read it from like if you do a network attack, as long as you get user, have user access in the OS, you can read it. And then timing attacks can, so all the attacks where just measure running time of an algorithm can usually be done over a network connection, as long as your network connection doesn't put in too many random delays and stuff like that. But I've seen several examples of attacks where you can do it over a network. Okay, so I'm basically done. I just want to show you, again, the hardware I'm using. It's from ChipWhisperer, and it's not very expensive, so if you just want to try it out, or even if you like make a product and you just want to check it. We used this when I worked for Thales Norway. We used this just to check some of the things we made. It's because it's a lot better than checking nothing, right? So it's made by New AA Technology, and it's called ChipWhisperer. If you need, like, I'm now shamelessly plugging my next employer, right? Because if you need like real help, if you have a product and you're like, can someone please test this for me? Their equipment looks more like that. It's a lot more fancy. They can do a lot more. They can compensate for a lot of noise. And one thing that people usually do to make this harder, like side channel analysis harder, you can put in random delays so that the 50 different plaintext blocks, the timings don't line up. But they have software, like their software is called Inspector, and they have a lot of things in there to correct for delays and everything. So, so you can either send stuff to them and have them analyze it, or you can buy this equipment if you have a lot of money. But I'm not saying you should buy it and take it home and play with it. But if you're a company who makes something that needs to be really secure, because like they do sell, it is a business to sell this stuff. So yeah. That's it. Sometimes I tweet, usually I don't, but if you want to find me, I'm there. And these are just, again, the links to the ChipWhisperer. So the hardware link is to where you can buy the hardware. And the software link is to the documentation that tells you how to use the software. And it also just gives you a link to GitHub. Yeah, I think that's it. I have like 10 minutes, so if there are questions, I can take questions. If not, you can just talk to me afterwards. Yes. Okay. I'm just going to do, yeah, I'll just get to this part and then we can. Sorry?
The next candidates on the line below, shouldn't they almost be random due to the diffusion of throughout the algorithm?
Yeah. So you wanted like 200? Takes a bit longer. Okay, so I'm going to just set the update interval back up. Should we even do more than 5? Okay. It's going to take a while. Okay, so you just thought the numbers, the correlation numbers weren't so good? Yeah. Yeah. I'll just let it run through, but we can take another question if there is one. Yeah.
I guess the attack point was not chosen randomly.
Yeah, no.
It's because of that's where the finite field operation takes place, which I guess.
No, so the question was why do we attack after the S-box? And again, since I'm not so good at this physics things, it's because it works. Someone else has shown that it works. But it's not the only way. And I think it's because enough data has changed. Because you could try attacking right after add round key, but I don't think, I'm actually not sure. But it's always like, if you can do it there, that's what you do. But sometimes you can't because AES, there are different ways of implementing it. So sometimes you attack at the end of the round. Or if you implement AES in hardware, say you do FPGA implementation, usually one round is done in one clock cycle. And there's no, like the output of the S-box isn't stored in a register, it just flows directly into the next function. And that doesn't impact the power consumption enough. So you look at, I think the thing they recommend for FPGA implementation is to look at the XOR of the input and the output of the round or something. But there are different, like they're called leakage models. It's, yeah, you determine based on just like, you do different examples and you see where you can actually get enough leakage data to correlate.
So I guess where I was going with it was my initial thought was that that's at that point we're doing something computationally expensive, and that's why we get a power spike.
We don't necessarily do something computationally expensive because the S-box, in software, it's usually implemented as a lookup table. So, so you just, I don't really understand what you mean now.
So you are attacking after you've done the XOR with the plain text and the key, and then you do the S-box, and then you do the
shift rows. And then finally you do the finite field thing.
You are looking at the point between after you've done the S-box, and then the shift rows. Isn't this where something computationally expensive
happens after that? Yeah. Yeah. So it's a quicker attack if you attack where we attack. Is that what you meant now?
No, it was a question
Yes.
other than AES? Because
Yeah.
are we using something intrinsic
No.
to AES?
No, you can do this on DES. You can do it, but you just need to know the algorithm, right? Because you need to be able to compute something inside it. So I think the first paper on this kind of analysis was done on DES. And I assume you can do it as long as you have the algorithm spec. You will just, you just need to find a place in the algorithm where the power consumption leaks enough, and you can compute the state. And there's only in AES you have to do the attack before you've added 2 round keys. Because when you've added 2 round keys, that you have too much guessing to do. And similarly, if you attack with a known plain text, you need to attack during the last round before you've added the second round key. But yeah, it works on other algorithms as well. And I didn't say anything about countermeasures because I only promised to show you how the attack works. But I can say just a few words. It's hard. For software, there is something called bit-sliced implementations. I think there's something called bare SSL where maybe they do that. But it's very I think it works with only 1 bit from each plaintext block at a time. So if you're going to encrypt 128 plaintext blocks, you can parallelize it. But yeah, it just divides it up so that what you do is completely different from this. There's also something called masking. It explodes the implementation. You take each bit of your secret and you replace it with several bits. And then you try to do the whole AES. And the way you do this is that, so you have an algorithm for how to replace 1 bit with several bits. There is randomness, but the final bit you add is like a checksum. So you can get back to your original bit. And then they figured out how to implement a NAND gate for this data structure so that it works. And you can build everything from NAND gates. So in theory, you can then build AES and get your correct ciphertext at the end. But yeah, it explodes. They do implement this in very high stakes things, in software or in hardware. But it's not something you want to do if you just want to make your AES a little bit more secure. You can also, this is the tried and true military way, make it hard to measure. Take your chip, pack it into epoxy, put something around it that if you poke a hole in it, it would shortcut the whole thing. Put metal around it so you can't do electromagnetic, and do something to the cables so they won't leak. This is also expensive. So basically all the solutions are expensive. So my main advice is to just think about where you actually need protection from this, and only apply protection where you need it. And I think, as I said, I think all symmetric algorithms are vulnerable to this. So don't give the equipment to the people who want to measure. Any more questions? Okay, thank you.